Good evening, everybody, or afternoon, or morning, whenever you're watching this. I'm going to sound like the Truman Show there for a second. Anyway, I found this book sent to me by a friend of mine, and it is called Automobile Engineering. It was, whatever that was in old money, 16, I don't know, shillings? I don't know. But it's basically a third edition with 512 pages, nearly 500 illustrations of then current automobile engineering. So it doesn't really sort of cover any particular cars in process, it's just general, cars in general, to be honest. Still got things such as adjusting the contact breaker points, servicing notes on recent models, garage equipment, electrical equipment, carburation, transmission, compression, ignition, so obviously diesel, servicing, suspension systems, the chassis, and other bits and bobs in there. I'm trying to find a publication date, so it doesn't seem to have anything there. Let's flip to the back and see if there's anything there that might give us a clue. No, nothing there. That looks like it's just an index. Now, there is on the inside cover, yeah, here we go. It does talk about cars made after 1947, so I'm wondering if this is actually from the 50s. We will soon find out. Let's have a look, and let's have a look at the chassis. So it's talking about conventional chassis, chassis frames, etc. So it is really sort of talking about old perimeter frame and conventional frame chassis, so backbone chassis, etc. It doesn't seem to have any reference so far to monocoques. This was the sort of chassis that a lot of cars in the 40s and 50s had. So you got these outriggers. Sorry, you got the outriggers here. You got body brackets there, and obviously the part going over the rear axle to the back of the car. This is really sort of a very traditional construction type, and what a lot of cars actually used at the time. Now, this was the sort of basic body that you had, so that's your chassis cum body construction. This is actually an Austin 8 chassis, so that's what that would have looked like. You can see obviously the main frame there with the floor pan and other associated items, and then you've got the body, which obviously goes on top. Now, obviously with monocoque designs, it took this whole frame assembly and made it part of the actual body itself, so you basically had a single unitary unit, whereas here it's obviously body on frame. I cannot think, apart from large American trucks, any production car that still uses body on frame construction. The last one I can think of was the Panther body, which would have been Ford Crown Victoria, Mercury Grand Marquis, and the Lincoln Town Car. Now, I think they went out of production in 2011, 2012 or so, so fairly recent, but they were the last example of body on frame construction. This would be an inswept chassis. You would sort of typically see those on sports cars of the era, but really this book is talking about stuff that is so out of date, it's unreal. The obviously suspension systems, it talks about very traditional suspension system setups, mainly sort of transverse and sort of forward to back leaf springs. Does it have anything else in there that looks more modern? Nope, it's all leaf springs and rear wheel suspension. So what's it using there? That's an interesting setup. So that is, God, that is quite elaborate, isn't it? So there must be that's really bizarre. Oh, that's a Rolls Royce. So the rear wheel suspension system, the rear axle is of the full floating type, with the road wheels being mounted solely on extensions of the axle tubes. The final drive is a hypoid spiral bevel gears, which is quite conventional, mounted on the rear axles, with the object of reducing the height of the whole chassis, and as a result lowering the centre of gravity. The road springs are encased in gaiters, and oil is supplied to them from the chassis lubrication system. Oh yes, that's something that Rolls-Royces used to have, because there were a lot of greasing points on older cars. Rolls-Royce engineered this whole system where it had a centralised oil grease vessel, which would then supply all of the grease points with oil, and it was wonderfully elaborate, as you can see, really over-engineered. So shock absorbers, obviously shock absorbers, you know, still very much a part of suspension setups these days. That one looks like a lever arm shock absorber. I'm not sure if we actually had telescopic shock absorbers at this time. Do you know, I don't think we did. We've also got this type of shock absorber, which is not fluid based. It's actually got stainless steel and non-corrosive frictional plates. That's interesting. So it actually uses almost like a scissor type mechanism that connects to probably one part to the body, the other to the movable assembly of the wheel, and by compressing together, the friction generated dampens the impact. That is absolutely fascinating. I never realised those existed. Oh, this is more conventional. You see this still in operation today in certain degrees. You've got the lower wishbone link spring in between, say, a sort of a main. In the case of, say, my XJ40, it's in a case of the subframe, but you've still got a lower wishbone. On the 40, you don't have an upper wishbone, but you do have sort of like a shock absorber that goes up to the inner wing area. Obviously, because this is for cars with chassis, very similar, except it's a lever arm shock absorber. So obviously coil spring, hub assembly or hub carrier, then that attaches to this lever arm shock absorber, which is pretty conventional for the day, and we still use that to a certain degree, although we have modified it greatly. But you do still see this treatment on certain vehicles even now. Obviously without the lever arm shock absorber, it would be a separate shock up there. So what else have we got? We have... yes, we've got the torsion beam independent suspension. So obviously a torsion beam is literally a bar that's under a lot of tension, and that provides a springing effect in conjunction with a shock absorber. Torsion beams, I don't know if they're still used now. I'm sure there is something out there that still uses them. The French use them an awful lot, although I think they've moved away to sort of coil springs at each corner, but certainly Citroën and Peugeot, they were used an awful lot throughout the 80s, 90s, and certainly into the early 2000s. So let's go forward and see what else we have. So we've got braking systems now. Now, I bet this will still be very much, yes, cable operated brakes. So, God, yes, that really is old. So you had literally cables operating all four brakes. Which was, well, it worked if it was well adjusted, but it could be very grabby, I guess, if it wasn't well adjusted. And does it talk about hydraulic brakes at all? So it's still talking about cable operated brakes. Then it's obviously talking about the various types of drum that were available. And drum brakes, we still have them now. They're not a modern invention by any means. And they are pretty much identical to, with a few modifications for self-adjustment. They're very similar to what you see here. What drum brakes that we use today, very similar to the ones that we use here. No mention so far of hydraulic brakes. Bendix seem to... yes, here we are. Bendix seem to produce brake shoe assemblies suitable for mechanical, pneumatic or hydraulic operation. So their own system's normally cable operated, self-compensating, and makes use of the self-wrapping shoe principle. A typical layout of the Bendix mechanism shown in Fig 17. So there's Fig 17. So that is a cable operated system showing various lubrication points. Bendix is a name that's still around today and still doing what they obviously did back then, of being an OEM for automobile manufacturers. And do we have anything that is vaguely, does it cover anything vaguely hydraulic? God, look at that, that's a very large, elaborate looking assembly. So that's 2 leading brake shoes. Then you've got Bendix Cowdery brakes. I'm guessing this is probably more for commercial vehicles, when you're sort of getting up to those sort of sizes. Then what else have we got? All very much cable operated. Girling brakes, so obviously Girling, they're still around and still doing pretty much exactly the same thing. Girling were and still are an aftermarket supplier of braking mechanisms. They do still exist. I think they might be part of Lucas these days, but they are very much still doing the same sort of thing. I think they've gone through sort of several different incarnations, but the Girling brand still exists. Lockheed, I got a feeling, Girling, Lockheed, I'm not sure if they're still around or not, if they have been absorbed into one of the other manufacturers, but Lockheed seem to use, or seem to, looking at this, pioneer this hydraulic system. So this is very similar to what we would use today, although nowadays we have a split system. So you have a diagonal split normally. This one, you've got no diagonal split. You literally just have front brakes, rear brakes. If you've got a diagonal split, it means if you lose one circuit, you've still got braking on at least one rear and one front wheel, which obviously makes things more balanced. But here, it's obviously split front to rear. And I would guess if you lose the rear brakes, because it doesn't look like a separate circuit, you would lose all brakes. You would lose pressure on the whole system. So it's not engineered or with safety in mind. Well, I suppose it is, because it's hydraulic braking, which is much more effective than the traditional cable type of brakes. But it's not engineered for fail-safe in mind, so to speak. Or at least I don't think it was. Now we're talking about master cylinders. Very similar operation to today. Vacuum servo unit, that is a little bit different these days. It uses engine manifold pressure. On diesels, it uses a little pump that's usually attached to the alternator to generate the required vacuum. And also, here we are talking about disc brakes. So disc brakes were a thing back then. That's a Lockheed assembly there, and we have brake cylinders going into the disc. So that looks like a sort of twin caliper system. Now we're talking about steering mechanisms. Now, does it talk about rack and pinion? Because rack and pinion would have been relatively new at this time, so it would be interesting to see if it is mentioned. So, obviously recirculating ball systems, all of that sort of stuff. And no, I don't think it does, actually. I think I've skipped forward to a different section. Yes, I have. I'm now on servicing front axle. Oh no, I'm still on steering mechanism. But what's quite cool is it's actually giving you major lubrication points on some of the most popular vehicles at the time. So this is the Austin 8 horsepower lubrication chart. This is the Ford Anglia and Prefect lubrication charts. That's the Hillman Minx there. That is the Morris 8. The Singer 9 Bantam. That sounds exciting. So how often did you... Oh my goodness. Every 1,000 miles, gearbox. Remove the filler and plug and replenish oil level. So you've got to drain the gearbox every 6,000 miles, clean out with paraffin and refill with fresh oil. The engine... Blimey. Every 1,000 miles, you had to apply a small amount of oil to the distributor, which is quite normal. There's a little pad on top that you've just applied oil to keep it lubricated. You can really sort of see, obviously back in these sort of days, the cars were not built for long distance journeys. There was a lot of interim servicing that you had to do. I'm trying to see if I can find where... Oh, here we go. Yeah, every 100 miles you check the oil level, and after the first 750 mile and subsequent 2,000 miles, drain the sump while the engine is warm and refill every 2,000 miles. Remove the oil filter, clean with petrol and replace. So the oil filters were designed to be reusable back in those days. But look at the sort of shortness of the interval. 2,000 miles intervals for draining and replenishing oil. Cars were not built back then for long distances. As time has gone on, and as more and more people are using cars, certainly for longer distances, intervals for oil changes and obviously technology surrounding filtration has improved, which has allowed us to have the long sort of 10,000 mile intervals that we enjoy today. And also with certainly with CV joints and other things encased in grease, really has removed the need for grease nipples. So this is the Vauxhall 10, 12 horsepower. I mean, we are looking really at a lot of pre-war stuff here. That's the Wolseley 10. Then we're talking about the power unit. This is probably going to be very much all side valves. Oh no, overhead valves. I was just about to take the mick, but no, that is an overhead valve unit. That is, do you know, I think that's the A series. Yeah, that's the that is the A series. That is the A40 power unit. Showing design features including push-rod operation overhead valves, chain-driven camshaft, thermostat-controlled coolant circulation, an impeller-type water pump, and a gear-type oil pump is driven from the camshaft skew gear, which also drives the distributor inlet, and the manifold incorporates an exhaust-heated hotspot. So obviously that means, because you've got the yeah, there you go. There's the manifold, inlet manifold drain pipe. Oh yeah, that's so. Oh yeah, so I'm guessing that will drain off any excess moisture, I would guess. There's a sort of like a little thing here which would heat fuel coming into the engine to let it vaporise more easily. On newer designs, certainly from the 80s, this was replaced with a sort of, particularly on Austin Rover stuff, you had this sort of like porcupine type hedgehog thing which would heat up and allow the fuel to vaporise, particularly useful in colder conditions. But when you look at the A series in context to a lot of other stuff that was around at the time, it does look bloody modern. Overhead valves, which I know is quite out of not being very modern anymore, but certainly things such as the pressurised oil lubrication and the actual sort of water pump driving coolant around the system. A lot of cars of this era used as you call it, convection fed systems. So there was no pump, it was literally sort of hot would rise into the radiator, cold would fall back into the engine. So really that was quite an advanced power unit for the time. Now I'm not sure if we are on anywhere coming near the era of overhead camshafts, but we will see. That's obviously a flathead design, which was still very typical back then. Talking about various different crankshaft arrangements. which is actually quite interesting. So typically you had, on a 4-cylinder engine, you had 1, 2, 3 main bearings, and that was your lot. And nowadays it's 5-bearing crank is the industry standard, to be honest with you. Or 5-bearing crank on 4-cylinder engines anyway. 3 bearings were prone to sort of go like that at higher speeds, higher engine speeds. 5 bearings is more refined and obviously sort of less chance of vibration and indeed less chance of things snapping, let's say. What are we covering in here? Data for petrol engines. We're covering stuff from 1938. Trying to see if there's any modern names in there. You've got the Ford V8, which developed 30 horsepower. Blimey, it still mentions Lanchesters. That really is going back some. Morris, no mention of the minor. It's just the old Morris models. Jaguar was still referred to as SS Jaguar. Daimler was a completely separate company in its own right. Triumph, they did exist, they were there, but not with any of the models that we would know now. So really this book is incredibly old and very interesting to look through. Oh, this is interesting. Have we got reference to... Is this an overhead cam engine? Yes, it is. So that's an overhead camshaft unit. I'm not sure what engine that is, but that does seem to be referenced in here as well. So obviously they did exist at the time. And yes, that was it. Thermosiphon circulation. So you had warm coolant rising literally to the top of the engine. So this would have been the cylinder head, which almost would have been just a cap on the top of the cylinder block, as it would have been just a side valve arrangement, just some spark plugs inside of it. Then that would go up into the radiator. You've got a cooling fan there. That would drop down to the bottom of the radiator once cool, and then go back in, circulate around the cylinders, and circulate around the engine. In lower power, low output and low stress situations, it's absolutely fine. It works, and obviously it worked very well. But with the increase in top speeds, the increase in engine power, being able to get the coolant out of the engine into the radiator as quickly as possible became much more of a concern. And that's why there was sort of around this time a lot of changes in the way that car manufacturers built engines, but indeed built cars. Certainly after the war, and this would have probably literally come out just after the war had finished, there was still a lot of pre-war designs in use, and as the years sort of went on, so say between sort of 1947 and 1955, there was a huge amount of development from car manufacturers at the time. You also saw, certainly in the British industry, a lot of older, rather smaller brands teaming up with larger brands and making such sort of eventually such organisations such as British Leyland. Well, Vauxhall was still Vauxhall, but I think they were part of General Motors. But also you had Vauxhall and Opel eventually sharing development. So things really sort of pushed forward after the war, when sort of people wanted to get mobile again and actually get out and start working and doing everything else that they needed to do. The car became a lot more affordable. A lot more people could have a car, and obviously that sort of drove development forward quite substantially. But this is really nice book. It's in really good condition, and it's just a very, very, very rather sort of pleasant look into how things once were and how manufacturers once did things, how everything used to be done. All very good, all very interesting indeed. Anyway, that is today's video, and that's really sort of in lieu of being able to do anything car related, because the The weather is not particularly pleasant. It is very cold, it's wet, because this was filmed back in January, and there's not really much that I can do at the minute outside. So I thought, I've had this little book for a while, I thought it would be a nice idea just to have a look at it. Anyway, if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thanks for watching, take care, and see you soon.